The car story. There was free coffee near the bathrooms and a bouquet of snacks in a vase on the counter, and I was thinking about you, about how long it's been since you died. Cookies and bright orange cheese crackers and delicate cellophane building forms in the vase. 20, you would have been by now. The waiting room TV at the car dealership had a show about blindfolded women in tropical clothing tasting food they couldn't see and possibly guessing what they were eating. I couldn't figure out the point exactly. The TV sound was off and the country music playing throughout the dealership revealed the vast expanse of the place, and I could hear the song in slight separation playing from different speakers like a series of echoes, as though everywhere in the dealership was set in a slightly different time. If you were alive, you'd be sitting beside me now because my old car would have become your car, and we'd be here to fix it so I could teach you something about life and cars, even though I know so little. But maybe you would have been the one to notice how the country song was out of sync, because you grew up with people who looked for things like that in the world, for strange lights in the forest, and sea glass, and rocks that were pretty when they were wet, and any breaks in time and space. We wouldn't go far, but we would have fun. Your mother and I held you in our arms in a way that I can't picture now, but the doctor carried you out in a cloth and handed you to us naked, and we held you in our arms. The song seemed to be about a barn, about a woman who would never again meet the singer at the barn. She was gone, but something else would soon arrive to take her place in the barn. Maybe it was a bottle of beer. At some point a few years back, almost all the public music at grocery stores and gas stations in the area had turned to country. I didn't dislike it, but felt it was music for people with different plans than I had. I'd come to the dealership to get my car inspected. I was late, as usual, and the police had pulled me over and given me a warning, as they did every year, as this was something like taxes and so many other things I can't even think about that I couldn't seem to face. I had newish tires, but all the lights on the dashboard were lit up and had been for some time. Someone automotive, maybe at the tire place, had told me that my brake pads also were thin, or the calipers rusty, or something was getting too close to something else. I needed the hospital of the car dealership, rather than the ambulance of a gas station. This was going to be an expensive, open-heart surgery type of visit. There would be a deep incision, and scars, and blood, and sadness, and anger. But there was anesthesia, too. A larger indifference. What did it matter, anyway? Who cared, really, about such things? The unknowable smell of the house when we finally went home. Your bedroom turned black when I looked in. At any moment, the mechanic would emerge from the bay and give me the first bad news. The mechanic's name was Albert, and he was surprisingly old. Most of the mechanics I've encountered in the last few years have been young, as though it was a young person's trade now, had become a kind of difficult sport. But Albert was in his 70s and had a pleasingly sharp face and a rope-like smile that tugged to one side that was actually very warm, as though Albert had, with some difficulty, remained real after all these years. The waiting room had 42 soft, minimalist black chairs. The moment I finished counting them, I wondered why I had this ongoing need to count things that didn't need counting. I tried to picture every seat taken, but then realized there were so many seats simply to give people the opportunity to sit as far away from each other as they liked. How slow we became, and for so long, with that new vacant field of time inserted into our lives, as though we could only exist for short breaths before needing to disappear and die ourselves with you for a while. It didn't seem right for such a large and complex business, with so many people hard at work in the automotive bays and in the odd partial offices in the showroom, that I should be the only customer. I checked my watch. It was 9 a.m. I continued to believe, despite wishing I would not, that knowing the time would provide a clarifying clue that could make sense of whatever confusion was afoot. But what confusion was afoot? I was confused about that more than anything else. It was 9 a.m., and what confusion was afoot? Albert emerged from the automotive bay holding what looked like a piece of blackened toast. He approached slowly, looking at the toast as though continually astonished to see he was still holding it. "Your engine filter," he said. "This should be in a museum." "Jesus," I said. "Replace?" Albert said. "Replace," I said. "Replace," Albert said to the engine filter, and turned back to the bay. I went into the showroom with its brand new cars turned at different angles. I hoped the salespeople had noticed me idling in the waiting room, hoped I'd been clearly set aside in their hard-selling minds as someone having his car repaired. I liked cars inside buildings. There was something attractively unnatural about a car inside a building, something almost perfect, because it was wrong. I looked inside the open window of a bright red SUV. The interior held a chilled black air like a glass of champagne. I had the many years older broken-down version of the same model. Mine was smaller and shabby as an old couch, or like an old shoe, I suddenly thought. My car, after such long use, had become like a shoe, and my body the foot that fit inside. This new updated version was larger and pumped full of air, it seemed to me. The steering wheel was not a circle, but a worrisome kind of airplane yoke, as though this car was ready for unexpected modern adventures, or was, in fact, on the cusp of flight itself. I was no longer interested in such adventures. Increasingly, I was putting some distance between myself and cusps of all kinds. Like the country music, like a lot of things, this shining indoor car with its spacious black interior was made for people with different plans than I. But there was such a surprising excess of space around everything, and too much air, I couldn't stop noticing. There wasn't a clutter of buttons and pockets and drawers and cup holders and trays for coins. It was actually hard to see anything of value or use or anything to manipulate, as though in the end they'd painted over everything with a kind of emptiness. Not only was there nothing there, but they'd hidden it as well. The seats were covered in a velvet black web that felt wet to the touch. In my peripheral vision, I saw someone fall down in the sales lot. I winced away and closed my eyes in the event this was a disaster I didn't want to see or feel. A wave of pain, regardless, crossed my body as I imagined falling to the ground. Then I looked again. An old woman lay on the ground in a Christina's World sort of pose. She had twisted around herself and was pushing up over her arms, and like that painting of the woman in the field, there was something both broken and seductive in the way she was trying to rise. If you glanced at the painting and Christina, you would think she was looking off towards someone she had just then fallen in love with. But if you continued looking, at some point, you'd see that Christina had not fallen in love, but had simply fallen. That she was twisting in pain to see if anyone was coming to save her, because she was all alone in a faraway field, and soon she would weaken and fall below the grasses, and then no one would find her. The woman who'd fallen in the lot seemed to be getting older as I looked at her, weaker and older, with a little boy's sprung steel haircut, like it had all been chopped off by one swipe of a garden blade. She wore loose pajama pants and pink slippers, and her ankles were cloud gray. She was saying things and drooling a bit, and the man beside her, her son, I guessed, though he was probably 70 himself, stood looking at the new car she'd fallen beside with his hands in his pockets, like a father who believes that ignoring an injured child not only prevented tears, but would lead that child to a stronger, better life. The old woman pushed against the black tire of the car beside her and tried to stand, and then fell to the ground, and I ripped my eyes away again. And when I looked back, she was on her stomach and hitting the blacktop with one fist, and 2 of the salesmen had gone to stand in the open showroom doorways, as though legally they could go no further. And the man with his hands in his pockets removed one hand and waved them off, and they let the door shut and stood behind the glass watching. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. "You there?" the text message read. I thought it was probably Albert, the mechanic, with another piece of my car, so I returned to the waiting room and wrote, "I'm here." The elderly woman who'd fallen, and the man who was probably her son, soon joined me in the waiting room. Before sitting down, they stared at the coffee machine and the vase of snacks with a kind of breathless anger, as though here was something else in the world that was free for everyone but them. When the man sat down across from me, he kept his hands in his pockets. The old woman was whispering things as though she'd been warned to whisper from here on out, and the son kept saying, "What?" in a blunt way that wasn't a question, but meant to make her stop talking, until she finally spoke loudly. "Do they know you're here?" she said. "They know," he said. "I don't think they know. How do they know?" she said. "They know, Ma," he said. "What is this place?" she said. "They're fixing the car," he said. "What's wrong with it?" she said. "They're fixing the tires," he said. "I don't think they know you're here," she said. "How do they know you're here?" "You're talking too loud again, Ma," he said, and she began to whisper. Albert emerged with his ropey-side smile from the bay, with something small and playful in one hand that almost looked like it was trying to get away, like a baby bird or something slippery he wanted to show me. "Spark plug," he said. "This is one of the good ones." "Jesus," I said. It looked like something dredged up from the Titanic, like an old bullet from an old war. "Replace them all?" Albert asked. "Replace them all," I said. "Replace them all," Albert said to the old bullet from the old war, and returned to the bay. The old woman whispered, "Do they know you're here? I don't think they know you're here. How do they know you're here?" "Go see what's in there, Ma," the son said, and he suddenly stood up and withdrew his hands and pushed her along toward the darkened playroom beside the coffee station, and I had the thought that he kept his hands in his pockets to keep himself from striking her. "What's in there?" she whispered, and I wondered if all she had left were questions now, and if all her questions weren't just questions about whether she was still alive. The son opened the door to the playroom, and the lights came on automatically, and a television came on, and a moment later a cartoon started playing. There were stickers on the playroom windows of letters and animals, and the chairs were of different colors, and there was a table in the middle with wooden train tracks, but no train, I could see. The son pushed the mother in and shut the door after her, and she stood looking at him behind the glass, still asking, "What's in there?" But when the son returned to the waiting room and sat, she sat too in the playroom, and soon lost all her motion and all the worry of her world, and seemed to fall asleep, and after a very short time the lights and the television in the playroom switched off, And the son laughed a little at that and turned it into a cough because he knew it sounded cruel. After you died, I would run miles in the woods, on little used trails, and finally stop when I felt you near, and I would call your name loudly as though you were simply lost in the forest. Even the sound of my voice confirmed this, that you were just lost. You were alive in my voice, and alive in the sound of your name, and alive in the forest when I called to you. The man took his hands from his pockets and set them on his knees and said, "Lasagna." He was staring at the television where the two blindfolded women in the tropical outfits were now eating lasagna with their bare hands and laughing. Another country song echoed from the different speakers, turning time into seeds and flowers blossoming across the dealership. Another song about losing someone and finding something else near a farm somewhere. Albert backed through the bay door, cradling something now in his arms in a kind of oilcloth. "Jesus," I would say. "Replace," he would say. "Replace," I would say. "Replace," Albert would say to you, but he wouldn't. Instead, he'd take you back to the old shoe of our car and set you back in exactly where he found you, for there is no new one of you coming along from anywhere, and so you'll have to make do with that and ride along with us as we go, because even though lost and gone, you are not only the last of your kind, and the foremost too, but the only thing we've ever found to replace you with is you.